Thank you for being here. I'm really happy to be able to speak to you. I'm going to be talking about two different but related topics. First, I'm going to be talking about the role of federal programs in affecting U.S. marital trends. And I'm also going to be talking about the effects of non-resident fathers on children. Okay. So there are a number of federal, in particular tax and benefit programs that theoretically have economic disincentives for marriage. That is, that a couple, two individuals who would get married would end up with either higher taxes or less likely to receive benefits than if they were to be two single individuals and decide not to marry. And I've listed some of the programs here. There's been a huge amount of research on this because this is really a concern, right? So the first topic I list is welfare benefits, now called TANF. It was a huge literature on that in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, looking because when you're a single person, you are less likely to receive benefits, and if you're married, the income of your spouse is treated less favorably than if you were married to the father of your children. Income is treated less favorably than if you were married to someone else. So there are clear theoretical disincentives, but out of the huge literature, and Robert Moffat is a major contributor to that literature, overall the results are maybe a small disincentive, but it's pretty small. So it's not the thing that's driving these changes in marriage rates that Andy Turlin showed you. Similarly, if we look at the federal income tax, and given that this is tax season, you may have heard about marriage bonuses and marriage penalties. In fact, earlier in the week, there was a nice article written by Upshot in the New York Times, gave a really great graph about the distribution of marriage penalties and marriage bonuses. So it turns out the tax system doesn't go in one direction. Some people actually receive more favorable treatment if they were going to be, or lower taxes if they were going to be married. But those are individuals that tend to have one earner earn a whole lot more than the other earner. A larger portion of individuals are actually experiencing marriage penalties, and those are the households where the two individuals have very similar earnings. And there's some evidence that this marriage penalty has been increasing over time. So again, potential concern, but all of the research that's been done on this really does not find that there's much of an effect of this tax system on marriage. I also list the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is part of the federal tax system, but targeted towards low-income individuals and with the intent of increasing labor supply. Similarly, that also has a marriage penalty for some and a marriage bonus for others. For example, if there was a low earnings woman, maybe a woman who was not working at all, if she was single, she wouldn't be eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit. If she married a man who was working, that couple could be eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, and there would be a bonus. But if there was a woman who had moderate earnings and she married a man who was also working, that might they might price themselves out of getting those kinds of benefits. So again, you've got benefits and you've got bonuses and you've got penalties. But the research is not generally finding much of an effect. I've looked through all this research, and I asked a number of my colleagues who are doing this work, and they really concurred with my assessment of the literature, that this is not what's explaining these changes in marriage. Now, Social Security is an interesting example. I have a colleague, Stacy Dicker-Conlin, who wrote a paper, and I love this title. It's called "Widows Waiting to Wed." and the idea was that that some widows who are widowed before the age of 60, once they reach 60, they're actually eligible if their spouse had worked under covered employment, they're eligible for Social Security based a widow's benefit. And but if they remarry before the age of 60, they're not eligible. So that's actually a pretty big disincentive. So what Stacy found, looking at marriage around the age of 60, she found that there was a slowing down among widows. There was a slowing down of getting married right before 60 and a speeding up after 60. So yeah, there was an effect kind of right around that age, but it was mostly an effect in a small delay. So overall, as I said, I think the conclusions are in the literature that if there's any effects, it's generally small. And maybe I want to summarize that by saying that in this case, love triumphs over economics. So, okay, so these are programs that they're not actually intended necessarily to influence marriage, but they potentially had some effects, or they had some economic disincentives theoretically. But now there are other policies that are specifically targeted towards trying to encourage marriage for some of the reasons that Andy Sherling was talking about, the recognition that marriage is a very good environment in which to raise kids. It can be a very good environment to raise kids. So hence the healthy relationship marriage education title. It's not just any old marriage, but a marriage where the parents are functioning well together, where they're able to cooperate, they're able to co-parent. That's the kind of environment that's good for kids to grow up in. But for many families, that's not the environment that they find themselves in. And so these programs started being developed in late 90s and 2000s to see if, one, you could help married couples stay married by teaching them some relationship education skills. Some other programs being targeted at non-married couples, the cohabiting couples that you just heard about earlier, to see if maybe they might get married if they got along better. These programs are kind of ongoing, and in fact, there's actually there's money to support these kinds of programs. Legislation has authorized a significant amount of money, and currently the Administration on Children and Families, which is in the Department of Health and Human Services, funds 60 community organizations across the country to provide these kind of relationship and marriage education services. And as I said, there's been a number of evaluations, and these have found small and mixed results. It's really difficult to look at impacts of policy on marriage because there's so much non-policy stuff going on that really determines whether people are going to want to do this very make this intimate, personal decision. Okay, so then we think about, instead of direct incentives, maybe indirect incentives for marriage. And by that I mean making low-income men more marriageable. I mean, and this was an argument that's been talking about for a long time. Goes back to William Julius Wilson, who tried to explain why marriage rates for African Americans were so low. And he said, well, among low-income individuals, there aren't any men who are worth marrying around, or very few. These men that are around have very low rates of education. They don't have good job prospects. A lot of them are in jail. And while I know there are a few marriages that occur to people in jail, generally that's not the best environment for a marriage. So the idea is that maybe thinking about improving the job skills, education, getting some of these college dropouts to get their degree, go on to community college, connect them with community college, connect them with the workforce training system so that they get this kinds of skills and they can get the kinds of jobs where they can actually contribute to a family. Issues about the criminal justice system. Many of them are in jail, although those rates are beginning to come down. But when they come back from prison, it's hard for them to get a job. It's hard for them to find housing. It's hard for them to find health care. So again, and many of these men are fathers. So thinking about this, so there's a number of programs that are really trying to help these men get their life back together so that they can then be really part of a family. So I conclude that this might be a potentially more promising approach, although we don't have an evaluation of a specific policy that shows, oh yes, it's accomplished all of this stuff. So that may be for the future. So now let me turn to this other topic, and the topic of father involvement. And one of the reasons that marriage is so is beneficial for kids is that the dad is able to be involved and can be involved in beneficial ways for kids. We know that when dads are involved, the kids have better cognitive outcomes, they have higher social competence, there's lower levels of aggressive behavior for boys, and girls have higher levels of mental health. Okay? So when the dads can contribute, there's some real benefits. But for non-residential fathers, there's a lot of barriers to being involved with their kids. When they have low education and job skills, they may not be able to pay child support. And maybe the mothers don't want them then involved, especially if these guys are, not only not paying money, but maybe they're involved in criminal behavior or doing drugs or whatever. So these men who are not marriageable, the moms may not actually want them in the kids' lives. And the dads may feel like this is, my role is to provide for my family economically, and I can't do that. So I'm gonna kind of withdraw, disappear. So there's some major problems, and I want to talk now about how child support policy can make a difference, and I'm going to talk about two examples from my own research. The first is looking at child support and child outcomes, and the research shows that when kids grow up in households with more income, they do better, right? So income does help. The question is, does child support help more than other types of income? And there's been another number of studies, and one of mine as well, that shows that child support does have a bigger impact than other kinds of income. Maybe it's because when it's received in the form of child support, it's targeted more towards children. Maybe it has something to do with how the receipt of child support actually affects the parents' relationship, and so then the environment is a lot better. So I think the policies that are targeted towards increasing child support, so increasing policies that really make dads pay child support, those can actually positively affect child's cognitive outcomes. And the second one I want to talk about, again, you can tell that I really like titles, so this was from a paper that we called Legislating Love. Well, you can't legislate dads to see their kids. You can make them pay child support, or at least make a lot of them pay child support through more effective policies. So the idea was, the payment of child support is great. I mean, for families who are actually receiving child support consists of, is about 16% of total income. So it's a real big chunk. So income is good, but does it have additional beneficial effects? And what we found here was, through various statistical methods, kind of looking at these policies, if we looked at dads who are on the margin of paying child support and they then are pushed over the margin and they pay child support because of these stricter child support policies, they are also more likely to see their kids. So it's not just the argument that, okay, good dads pay money and also see their kids, but it's the argument that if they weren't going to pay child support, and there's this policy that kind of gets them to pay child support, it affects family relationships. And again, it may be that the dads are more encouraged to be involved because now they're standing up and they're contributing. It may be that the moms are more willing for the dads to be involved. So child support is one of those policies, I think, that has really good effects in multiple dimensions. So I think I would just want to conclude by saying, there's these two kinds of policies I've talked about. You've got policies that are really potentially had economic disincentives to marry, and policymakers were really worried about that. But those don't seem to be having the negative consequences that people had feared. But then you have something like child support, and I think there's really strong evidence that that there are some real positive effects on family functioning that are due in part to this particular policy. Thank you.